Next up is the large intestine. So the large intestine is actually made of different parts. So when food enters the large intestine, it's entering into an area called the cecum, right? So don't forget, the ileocecal valve is the sphincter between the ileum of the small intestine and the cecum of the large intestine. So the ileocecal valve will allow undigested residues from the small intestine to enter into the large intestine. From there, those residues will move through the colon. The colon has different parts, right? We have the ascending colon, which moves these materials upward, the transverse colon, which moves them horizontally, and then we have the descending colon, which brings these residues down, and then there's a little curve at the end of the descending colon, and that's called the sigmoid colon. From there, the undigested residue will enter into the rectum and then the anus, and then it will be expelled out of the body. So the job of the large intestine is to prepare the undigested materials for defecation. And by preparing these undigested materials, what it's doing is adding mucus to them, which makes it easier to pass, and absorbing some extra nutrients out of them, like water, maybe some electrolytes. So the large intestine does store and expel feces. So feces ultimately is basically fiber, which is undigested residues. It also contains water, mucus, and bacteria. There's lots and lots of bacteria in the large intestine, and you want that bacteria there. Right? It's healthy bacteria for the most part, just as long as it stays in your large intestine. And one of the jobs of the bacteria, or this normal flora as we call it in the large intestine, is production of vitamin K. So we get about 10% of our daily value of vitamin K from the bacteria in our large intestine that produce it, and then we absorb that vitamin K into our bloodstream. But the bacteria in the large intestine do a lot of other things too, and we're just kind of now getting to know the role of these bacteria in the health of our body. So I want to talk a little bit about the process of defecation, right? So as the undigested food residue builds up in the rectum and the anal canal, it will create a pressure, and a signal will be sent based on this pressure to the brain. And when the brain receives the signal, basically you're going to start thinking, okay, I need to find a place to go to the bathroom. And it's waiting for voluntary relaxation of the external anal sphincter. So we actually have two anal sphincters, the internal anal sphincter, which is not under voluntary control, and then there's the external anal sphincter, which is the last sphincter before the fecal matter will leave the body. And that is made of skeletal muscle, and it is under voluntary control. The external anal sphincter is the sphincter that children need to learn to control in order to graduate out of diapers. While we're talking about the large intestine, I'd like to talk about two associated things, constipation and diarrhea. So constipation is difficulty passing fecal matter, and often this is caused by the fecal matter being too dry. And one of the things that can dry out the fecal matter is ignoring signals for defecation. So basically, if we can continue to ignore those pressure signals going to our brain saying it's time to defecate, then what happens is the feces remains in the large intestine, and the large intestine continues to absorb water out of the fecal matter. So every time you ignore that signal, more and more water will be pulled out of the fecal matter, and it gets drier and drier and drier, and then it becomes very difficult to pass. Constipation, though, can also be caused by medications too. One of the main things that we can do to alleviate constipation is to consume some sort of product that is not absorbable. So for example, there's something called Miralax, and Miralax contains a compound that we cannot absorb. So when you take in the Miralax, basically the Miralax goes through the esophagus, through the stomach, through the small intestine, and then the Miralax enters into the large intestine. And because there's so much of this Miralax in the large intestine, it acts as an osmotic agent. And basically what's happening is we're going to draw water out of the body and bring that water into the large intestine where the Miralax is, because water just follows solutes. So basically the Miralax is just acting as a solute in the large intestine. So the water comes rushing into the large intestine, and that can help to alleviate the constipation. Related, but quite opposite, is diarrhea. So with diarrhea, what we have is frequent and fluid defecation. And this is often caused by the presence of non-absorbable components in the large intestine. So, for example, sometimes kids might drink a lot of juice, and they consume so much juice that a lot of the solutes that are in the juice don't have time to be absorbed in the small intestine, and so those solutes are passed on to the large intestine, and in the large intestine they act as an osmotic agent. Water will move out of the body into the large intestine, causing diarrhea. Diarrhea can also be caused by pathogens and by medications too. Now let's take a look at accessory organs to the digestive system. So these are organs that help out with the digestive tract, but food does not actually pass through them. Okay? We've already mentioned all of these, but we're just going to take a look at them in a little bit more detail and review. So first up are the salivary glands. So the salivary glands don't actually come into contact with your food, but they do produce your saliva, and saliva makes deglutition easier, which is swallowing. But salivary glands also do put some digestive enzymes into your food too. Then there's the liver, right? One of the main jobs of the liver involved with digestion is the production of bile. So bile was that substance that emulsified fats, made fats easier to digest. And liver produces bile, and one of the components to bile is actually made from the breakdown of red blood cells. So in the spleen, we break down our dead and dying red blood cells, and some of the components within those red blood cells are sent over to the liver, and the liver uses them to make bile. And this substance, which is bilirubin, gets turned into stercobilin inside of the digestive tract, and the stercobilin is brown, which is what makes fecal matter brown. The liver also plays a role with metabolism, which is digestive related. What's going on here is the liver is capable of producing glucose. So your liver can actually make glucose from things like amino acids and fats. And the liver also can store glucose. It stores glucose in its storage form called glycogen. The liver can also store our fat-soluble vitamins, which are vitamins A, D, E, and K. So the liver has a lot of fat in it, and that's why it can store the fat-soluble vitamins. And then also, the liver plays a big role with detoxification. There happens to be a lot of toxins in the foods that we consume, and those are absorbed, like our nutrients, those are absorbed by the small intestine, and they enter into the bloodstream, but then the blood brings that freshly absorbed material right to the liver, where the liver kind of picks through it looking for toxins and detoxifies them. The gallbladder is an organ that's located on the inferior surface of the liver, and the gallbladder's job is to store and concentrate the bile that's made by the liver. So the gallbladder does have some muscle around it, and when food enters the duodenum, that muscle will squeeze and it squirts the bile from the gallbladder into the duodenum. And as I mentioned before, bile is important for the emulsification of fats. Emulsification is the process of mixing fats with water, and this is necessary because the digestive enzymes that break down fats like to be in a watery environment, not a fatty environment. Next is the pancreas. The pancreas plays a couple different roles with the digestive system. One of its roles is to produce digestive enzymes and buffers and release those into the duodenum. Now, these digestive enzymes do the bulk of the digestion in the duodenum. It's breaking our proteins down and breaking our carbohydrates down into their smallest forms. There's also buffer in the pancreatic juice, and the buffer is necessary to combat that acidic nature of the chyme that's coming in from the stomach. So don't forget, these pancreatic enzymes like to work in a neutral environment, not an acidic environment, and the buffers help to neutralize the pH. The pancreas plays another role that's related to digestion, though, and that has to do with regulating our blood glucose levels. So the pancreas produces two hormones, insulin and glucagon, which both play a role in regulating blood glucose levels. Insulin is a hormone that's released from the pancreas during our fed state. And the fed state is referred to as the state of when you are eating or you've just eaten a meal. Okay? If you've just eaten a meal, or if you are eating a meal, then what's happening is your blood glucose levels are going up. That's because you're absorbing glucose from your food into your bloodstream. That makes sense. But you don't want your blood glucose levels to become too high, because high blood glucose levels can actually damage your blood vessel walls and damage your kidneys and cause lots of problems. So we want to maintain our homeostatic levels of blood glucose. So what's going to happen is, as your blood glucose levels go up, your pancreas will release insulin. And insulin is a hormone that travels through your bloodstream, and it targets various cells in the body, and it tells those cells to take the glucose out of the blood and bring it into their own self. And so by telling cells to take glucose out of the blood and bring it into themselves, we can help to reduce the blood glucose levels. Insulin does also send a signal specifically to the liver, and it tells the liver to grab glucose out of the bloodstream and store it as glycogen. And this is important because when we're between meals, we're going to need that stored glycogen. Which brings us to the next hormone, glucagon. So the pancreas releases glucagon during our fasting states. So your fasting state is when you're between meals. So between breakfast and lunch, between lunch and dinner, between dinner and breakfast. Those are your fasting states, right? And during your fasting state, because you're not absorbing glucose, because you're not eating anything, your blood glucose levels start to drop. And you don't want your blood glucose levels to get too low, because if they get too low, then obviously your cells will begin to starve, your nervous system can shut down, you can pass out, it can be dangerous. So your pancreas will release glucagon as your blood glucose levels start to drop. And glucagon is a hormone that sends signals mostly just to the liver, telling the liver to release the store of glucose, right? So don't forget, when we were in our fed state, we were racking up the storage of glucose inside the liver. Now, though, is the time to release the storage of glucose. So glucagon tells the liver to go ahead and release the glucose into the bloodstream, and that will bring the blood glucose levels back up and help to maintain those homeostatic levels. Diabetes is a condition where we have an inability to regulate blood glucose levels. And there are two main types of diabetes, type 1 diabetes and type 2. Type 1 diabetes is also known as insulin-dependent diabetes, and this is caused by an autoimmune disorder. So these individuals are unable to make insulin because their body has destroyed their insulin-producing cells in their pancreas. So these people are dependent upon insulin injections, hence insulin-dependent diabetes, in order to regulate blood glucose levels. So these people have to monitor their blood glucose levels, and then if their blood glucose levels become too high, they will need an insulin injection. And a lot of this can be done now through insulin pumps. So it makes regulating the blood glucose levels a lot easier. Type 2 diabetes is a little bit different. Type 2 diabetes is, there's not a problem with a lack of insulin. The problem is that the body is not actually reacting to the insulin properly. So sometimes what's happening here is that the body is resisting the insulin, so hence the term insulin resistance. Type 2 diabetes is often associated with body weight. So individuals that do start to have type 2 diabetes, they can often get rid of the type 2 diabetes just by bringing their weight down to a normal, healthier level. Let's trace the path of food through the digestive tract. Okay. So food will enter through the mouth, and then it will go to the oropharynx, laryngopharynx, esophagus, cardiac sphincter, stomach, pyloric sphincter, duodenum, jejunum, ileum, ileocecal valve, cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, anal canal, internal anal sphincter, external anal sphincter, anus.